Have you ever wondered what dark secrets were hidden in the isolated cabins of America's frontier? When Isabella Thompson discovered a hidden diary in her grandmother's attic, she never expected it would reveal a horrifying family legacy that had been buried for generations. The faded pages told a story so disturbing that it changed everything she thought she knew about her ancestors' life in the Wild West. The isolated nature of frontier life created conditions where the darkest human behaviors could flourish unchecked. For families living miles from their nearest neighbors, the normal social boundaries that prevent inappropriate relationships were often dangerously weakened. The Thompson family settled in a remote valley in Wyoming Territory in 1867, where the nearest town was a 3-day ride away. This isolation would prove to be the perfect breeding ground for disturbing family dynamics that would remain hidden for decades. The patriarch, Jeremiah Thompson, ruled his household with an iron fist, keeping his wife and 5 children completely under his control. What outsiders saw as a hard-working pioneer family was actually a prison where unthinkable acts occurred behind closed doors. Isabella's discovery of her great-grandmother's diary would finally bring these horrifying truths to light, revealing how incestuous relationships were sometimes a dark reality of frontier life. The diary began with innocent entries about the hardships of establishing a homestead, but gradually revealed something more sinister developing within the family's isolated cabin. The great-grandmother Elizabeth wrote of her growing concerns about her husband's unusual interest in their eldest daughter, Mary. "I catch him watching her in ways no father should look upon his child," one entry read, sending chills down Isabella's spine. Elizabeth's helplessness permeated every word as she described being trapped in the wilderness with nowhere to turn for help. The family's isolation made them entirely dependent on Jeremiah, creating a perfect environment for abuse to flourish unchecked. In those days, family matters were considered strictly private, and the concept of incest as a serious crime was not widely acknowledged. Elizabeth's diary entries became increasingly desperate, describing how she tried to keep her daughters away from their father, often taking beatings herself as a distraction. Historical records show that incest was more common on the frontier than most history books acknowledge. The combination of isolation, harsh living conditions, and lack of social oversight created situations where family boundaries could become dangerously blurred. In many cases, women and children had no escape routes or support systems to help them. Law enforcement was often days away, if it existed at all in their region. Churches and communities that might have intervened were too distant to notice what happened behind closed doors. Isabella was shocked to learn that her family's dark history wasn't as unusual as she might have hoped. Research into frontier life revealed that when families were isolated for months or years, particularly during harsh winters, the normal social taboos could break down in disturbing ways. What made the Thompson case particularly horrifying was the systematic nature of the abuse as documented in Elizabeth's increasingly frantic writings. The diary revealed that by 1869, Elizabeth had become aware that Jeremiah was visiting their eldest daughter's bed at night. Her entries became shorter and more coded, as if she feared her husband would discover her documentation of his crimes. "M cried again today. Nothing I can do to stop him. God forgive us all," read one particularly heartbreaking entry. Elizabeth described her own powerlessness in the situation, having no money, no nearby family, and nowhere to flee with 5 young children in the wilderness. Winter months were the worst, when deep snow cut them off completely from the outside world for weeks at a time. The family lived in constant fear of Jeremiah's unpredictable rages, which often resulted in brutal beatings. Elizabeth wrote of her attempts to protect her children, but her options were severely limited by their circumstances. The diary painted a picture of psychological terror as effective as any physical prison, with the vast, unforgiving wilderness serving as the bars that kept them trapped. As Isabella continued reading the diary, she discovered that the situation had grown even more disturbing by 1870. Elizabeth wrote about her horror when she realized her second daughter, Sarah, was beginning to receive the same unwanted attention from Jeremiah that Mary had endured. "He has that look again. Now for S. I must find a way to end this nightmare," Elizabeth wrote with shaking handwriting that betrayed her desperation. The diary detailed Elizabeth's increasingly desperate attempts to protect her daughters, including trying to arrange marriages for them at very young ages, simply to get them away from their father. She even approached a passing trader about taking her daughters east to live with distant relatives, but Jeremiah discovered her plan and beat her so severely, she nearly died. Isabella found herself emotionally exhausted as she read about her ancestors' suffering, but something compelled her to continue, as if giving witness to Elizabeth's ordeal was the least she could do after all these years. The isolation that made frontier life so dangerous for victims was compounded by the social attitudes of the time. Women and children were essentially considered property of the male head of household, with few legal protections. Even if Elizabeth had managed to escape with her children, she would have faced enormous obstacles as a woman alone in that era. Without money, skills to earn a living, or social support, many women felt trapped in abusive situations with no way out. Historical records show that some frontier women did flee with their children, often facing starvation, exposure to the elements, or other dangers that sometimes proved fatal. Isabella found herself wondering what she would have done in Elizabeth's situation, trapped in a remote cabin with children to protect and nowhere safe to go. The diary made clear that Elizabeth had considered every possible avenue of escape, but each one seemed more dangerous than enduring their current situation. A turning point came in the diary during the spring of 1871, when Elizabeth wrote about a traveling preacher who stayed with the family for several days. She managed to speak with him privately, hinting at the horrors occurring in their home. The preacher seemed concerned, but ultimately told her that a wife's duty was to submit to her husband and that family matters should remain private. "Even God's messenger turns a blind eye," Elizabeth wrote bitterly. This rejection by someone who could have helped appeared to break something in Elizabeth. Her subsequent entries became darker, with references to ending their suffering by any means necessary. Isabella could feel her ancestors' desperation growing with each page, the handwriting becoming more erratic. Elizabeth began writing about collecting certain plants and berries from the surrounding wilderness, with careful notes about their properties. Isabella, with her background in botany, recognized many of these as poisonous species native to Wyoming. The historical context of frontier justice helps explain why so many victims had nowhere to turn. In many remote areas, the law was days away, if it existed at all. Women who tried to report family abuse were often dismissed or even punished for speaking against their husbands. The concept of children's rights was virtually non-existent, and incest was rarely prosecuted unless it became public knowledge in a way that scandalized the community. Even then, it was often the victims who suffered the most from such exposure, branded as ruined or somehow complicit. Isabella's research into frontier newspapers and court records showed how rarely such cases were addressed, even when there was substantial evidence. She found records of a case just 20 miles from her ancestors' homestead, where a mother and daughters had fled an abusive father, only to be returned to him by the local sheriff who declared it a family matter, not requiring legal intervention. The diary reached its most chilling point in the winter of 1871-72, with an entry simply stating, "It ends tonight. God forgive me, but there is no other way." The next several pages had been torn out, leaving Isabella frantically searching for answers. When the diary resumed 2 weeks later, Elizabeth's tone had completely changed. "We are free now. The nightmare is over," she wrote cryptically. "They believe it was his heart that gave out. Only Mary knows the truth, and she will keep our secret to her grave." Isabella sat stunned, realizing her great-grandmother had likely poisoned her abusive husband to protect her children. The entries that followed described their struggle to maintain the homestead without Jeremiah. But despite the hardships, Elizabeth's relief was palpable in every word. "Better to struggle against the wilderness than to live with a monster," she wrote. "The girls sleep peacefully now. No more crying in the night." Historical research has uncovered small settlements where genetic abnormalities became increasingly common due to intermarriage between closely related families. With few new settlers arriving in some remote areas, the available marriage pool could become dangerously limited within a generation or two. Some communities developed their own unspoken rules about such relationships, creating cultural bubbles where practices that would be taboo elsewhere became normalized. Isabella discovered that the valley where her ancestors had settled had been home to several interrelated families, with suspiciously similar physical characteristics and recurring health problems. County records showed an unusually high rate of infant mortality and developmental issues in the area, classic signs of the genetic consequences of inbreeding. These communities often became increasingly isolated by choice, developing a distrust of outsiders who might judge their practices. The final pages of Elizabeth's diary detailed how she and her daughters gradually rebuilt their lives after Jeremiah's death. The neighboring homesteader, a widower named John Miller, began helping them with difficult tasks, eventually courting Elizabeth with a gentleness that seemed to surprise her. He speaks softly to the girls and never raises his hand, even when angry, she wrote wonderingly, as if such normal behavior was remarkable. The diary ended on a cautiously hopeful note, with Elizabeth accepting John's proposal of marriage, but insisting on conditions to protect her daughters. Isabella was moved by her great-grandmother's resilience and her determination to break the cycle of abuse. She learned that Elizabeth and John had gone on to have 2 more children together, one of whom was Isabella's grandfather. What struck Isabella most was how completely this family history had been buried, with no hints passed down through the generations about their traumatic past, or Elizabeth's desperate act to save her children. Frontier communities developed various methods for dealing with suspected incest, though intervention was rare. In some cases, vigilante justice was applied when abuse became known, with perpetrators driven out or even killed by outraged neighbors. More commonly, communities turned a blind eye, especially when the families involved were respected or powerful. Religious leaders sometimes intervened, though their approaches varied widely depending on their denominations and personal beliefs. Some offered sanctuary to victims, while others pressured them to forgive their abusers and maintain family unity at all costs. Court records from territorial Wyoming show only 3 prosecutions for incest over a 20-year period, despite evidence suggesting the problem was far more widespread. Isabella found historical accounts of frontier doctors who documented treating young girls for injuries consistent with sexual abuse, but rarely reported these findings to authorities. The social cost of acknowledging such crimes often seemed too high for communities struggling to present themselves as civilized outposts of American expansion. The psychological impact of incest on frontier families created generational trauma that often went unaddressed. Isabella noticed patterns in her family history that suddenly made sense in light of Elizabeth's diary. Her grandfather had been known for his overprotectiveness toward his daughters, installing multiple locks on doors and never allowing them to be alone with male relatives or visitors. What had seemed like frontier paranoia now appeared to be the vigilance of someone who perhaps knew something of his family's dark history. Isabella's own mother had always displayed inexplicable anxiety about her children's safety, particularly her daughters. These behavioral echoes through generations showed how trauma could be transmitted, even when the stories themselves were suppressed. Historical psychologists who study frontier families have documented similar patterns in other families with histories of abuse, where protective behaviors become family traditions without the original context being shared or understood. As Isabella processed the disturbing revelations from her family's past, she began to understand how the isolation of frontier life created perfect conditions for abuse to flourish. The physical distance from neighbors and authorities combined with the psychological isolation of women and children who had no independent means of survival. Weather conditions could trap families together for months, with no escape or outside contact. The severe consequences of being cast out from the family unit, likely death from exposure or starvation, meant victims often endured abuse rather than risking escape. Isabella found accounts from other frontier women that echoed Elizabeth's experience, with one writing, "Better the devil you know than the wilderness alone." This pragmatic calculation kept many women and children trapped in horrific situations, with frontier mothers often forced to make impossible choices about which horrors their children might better survive. The diary had shown Elizabeth's agonizing decision-making process, weighing continued abuse against the dangers of flight, until she finally chose a third option that carried its own terrible risks. The legal framework of the American frontier provided little protection for victims of family violence. Women had few rights of their own, with married women in particular having almost no legal standing separate from their husbands. Children were essentially considered property until they reached adulthood. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in law, and physical discipline of both wives and children was widely accepted. In this context, incest occupied an ambiguous position, recognized as taboo but rarely addressed by legal authorities unless it created public scandal. Isabella discovered that Wyoming Territory, where her ancestors had settled, was actually more progressive than most regions in granting women legal rights, being the first to give women the vote in 1869. Yet even there, the isolation of homesteads and the practical difficulties of law enforcement meant that legal protections often existed only on paper for the most remote families. Elizabeth's diary never mentioned considering legal action, suggesting she knew such an approach would be futile in their circumstances. The most disturbing aspect of Isabella's research was discovering how the trauma of frontier incest created cycles that sometimes continued for generations. In some isolated communities, practices that began out of desperation or pathology gradually became normalized, with victims growing up to become perpetrators. Public health records from the early 20th century documented certain remote valleys and settlements where social workers found alarming patterns of family sexual abuse that had become entrenched over decades. Breaking these cycles typically required outside intervention, often when railroads or new roads finally connected these isolated communities to broader society. Isabella wondered what would have happened in her own family if Elizabeth hadn't taken her desperate action to end the abuse. Would the pattern have continued through more generations? She found evidence in her family tree of female relatives who never married, became nuns, or moved as far from the family homestead as possible, choices that might reflect their own experiences or knowledge of the family's dark history. Medical records from frontier settlements provide further evidence of the prevalence of incest during this period. Doctors occasionally documented treating young girls and women for injuries consistent with sexual abuse, though such records were often coded or euphemistic due to the taboo nature of the subject. High rates of pregnancy in very young girls sometimes raised suspicions, though these were rarely investigated thoroughly. The physical and psychological consequences for victims were severe and lifelong. Elizabeth's diary mentioned her eldest daughter Mary's recurring nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and eventual inability to bear children, all consistent with the long-term effects of childhood sexual trauma. Isabella found herself deeply moved by these accounts of suffering, understanding how the wounds of such abuse extended far beyond the initial violations. Her research into psychological studies of frontier women's writings revealed common themes of depression, anxiety, and dissociation in those who had experienced family sexual abuse. These women often described themselves as feeling hollow, or already dead, psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to endure their circumstances. Cultural attitudes toward sexuality and family on the frontier complicated responses to incest. The Victorian era's extreme reluctance to discuss sexual matters meant that victims often lacked even the vocabulary to name what was happening to them. Children were typically kept ignorant about sexual development and behavior, making them vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. The frontier emphasis on family loyalty and privacy created additional barriers to disclosure. Family business stays in the family was a common saying that effectively silenced victims. Religious teachings often emphasized female purity and submission to male authority, creating crushing shame for victims who were made to feel complicit in their own abuse. Isabella found evidence of these attitudes in Elizabeth's diary, where she repeatedly blamed herself for failing to protect her daughters despite her desperate efforts to do so. The diary showed Elizabeth's internal struggle between her religious beliefs, which told her to honor her husband, and her maternal instinct to protect her children at any cost. The economic realities of frontier life created powerful dynamics that facilitated abuse and prevented escape. Women and children were essential labor forces on homesteads, but had little control over the fruits of their work. A wife who fled an abusive husband would likely lose everything: her home, possessions, and often even her children, whom courts typically awarded to fathers. With few employment opportunities for women beyond domestic service, prostitution, or teaching if qualified, economic independence was nearly impossible to achieve. Elizabeth's diary detailed the family's financial dependence on Jeremiah, who controlled every aspect of their resources. She described hiding small amounts of food, seeds, and occasionally coins, creating a meager emergency cash that would have been grossly insufficient for escape. The diary showed her calculating again and again how long her children might survive on what she could carry if they fled, always concluding that the risk of starvation was too great. This economic trap was common to frontier women, making them vulnerable to all forms of abuse with few viable options for escape. Frontier communities sometimes developed informal systems for protecting vulnerable members, though these were inconsistent and often inadequate. Isabella discovered accounts of neighbor women who created codes to check on each other's safety, sharing work activities like quilting or canning that allowed them to meet without male supervision. Some communities had widows' houses, where women in dangerous situations might find temporary refuge. Churches occasionally served as sanctuaries, though their effectiveness depended entirely on the attitudes of individual pastors. Elizabeth's diary mentioned no such support systems in their isolated valley, highlighting how the most remote families were also the most vulnerable. When Elizabeth finally confided in the traveling preacher, his dismissive response demonstrated how these informal protections could utterly fail those who needed them most. Isabella found historical accounts of other frontier women who, like Elizabeth, ultimately resorted to desperate measures when all other options for protection failed. Diaries and letters from the period contained coded references to abusive men who died suddenly from accidents or unexplained illnesses, suggesting Elizabeth's solution was not unique. The physical landscape of the frontier itself contributed to the dynamics of abuse. Vast distances between settlements, harsh weather conditions, dangerous terrain, and natural threats like predators and hostile indigenous tribes all served to trap victims with their abusers. Elizabeth's diary described their homestead as being 3 mountain ridges away from help, a distance that might as well have been 1,000 miles when immediate intervention was needed. Winter storms could isolate families for weeks or months, creating pressure cooker environments where tensions and abuse escalated. The diary entries from winter months were consistently more desperate than those written in summer, when at least the theoretical possibility of escape or outside contact existed. Isabella found similar patterns in other frontier accounts, with abuse often intensifying during periods of forced confinement. The diary described Elizabeth's attempts to create safe spaces within their small cabin, arranging sleeping areas to put herself between her husband and daughters. But in such close quarters, these efforts could only provide limited protection. The generational consequences of frontier incest extended beyond psychological trauma to include genetic impacts in some communities. In the most isolated settlements where new settlers rarely arrived and outmigration was difficult, the available marriage pool could become dangerously limited within a few generations. Historical medical records from some remote valleys documented increasing rates of birth defects, developmental delays, and specific genetic disorders associated with consanguineous relationships. Isabella's research into county birth and death records for the region where her ancestors had settled showed troubling patterns in some of the most isolated communities, though her own family had apparently avoided this particular consequence of frontier isolation. The Thompson family's nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, showed a concerning pattern of infant mortality and inherited conditions that suggested potential inbreeding over several generations. Elizabeth's diary mentioned her concerns about the Henderson family, noting that they keep too much to themselves even for these parts, and that their children showed troubling similarities in face and form. Church records occasionally mentioned inappropriate relations or unnatural behavior that required penance or excommunication, but specifics were seldom recorded. Medical records, when they existed, used coded language that requires careful interpretation by modern researchers. Isabella's historical investigation revealed how thoroughly this aspect of frontier life had been erased from conventional narratives, replaced with romanticized images of pioneering families conquering the wilderness. The reality, as Elizabeth's diary made clear, was that the wilderness sometimes provided cover for the worst human behaviors, rather than bringing out the noble qualities celebrated in frontier mythology. Isabella found herself becoming increasingly committed to bringing these hidden histories to light, feeling that acknowledging the suffering of past victims was a form of delayed justice. The specific dangers faced by indigenous or mixed-race children on the frontier represented a particularly dark chapter in this history. Historical records document cases of Native American children being taken into white households as servants or adopted family members, where they were especially vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. These children had even fewer protections than white children, with authorities showing little interest in their welfare. Elizabeth's diary mentioned a neighboring homesteader who had acquired a young indigenous girl through unclear means, noting her concerns about the child's treatment and her powerlessness to intervene. Isabella's research into territorial records confirmed that legal authorities rarely investigated allegations of abuse against indigenous children, even in cases where evidence was substantial. The frontier's complex racial dynamics created additional layers of vulnerability for certain children, with mixed-race children often facing the greatest risks due to their ambiguous social status. These children frequently existed in a legal and social limbo, claimed by neither white nor indigenous communities, making them perfect targets for predators. The role of frontier mothers in these situations was complex and often heartbreaking. Like Elizabeth, Many found themselves trapped between their duty to protect their children and their limited power to do so effectively. Diaries and letters from the period reveal the agonizing calculations these women made, trying to minimize harm while working within severe constraints. Some mothers attempted to marry their daughters off at extremely young ages, seeing early marriage as the lesser of available evils. Others took their children and fled into uncertain futures, facing starvation, exposure, or violence from strangers. A few, like Elizabeth, chose deadly intervention when all other options failed. Isabella found accounts of frontier women who died trying to protect their children from abuse, their sacrifices largely forgotten by history. Elizabeth's diary revealed the toll that her protective efforts took on her physical and mental health, with references to sleepless nights spent guarding her daughter's bedroom door and the constant stress of anticipating her husband's moods and movements. The diary showed Elizabeth's gradual transformation from a conventional pioneer wife to someone willing to commit the ultimate transgression to end her family's suffering. Religious beliefs played a significant and sometimes contradictory role in how frontier families and communities addressed incest. Many Christian denominations emphasized female submission and male authority within families, creating environments where questioning a father's behavior was seen as sinful in itself. Yet these same religious traditions contained clear prohibitions against incest, creating moral dilemmas for believers who suspected such abuse. Elizabeth's diary revealed her spiritual crisis as she tried to reconcile her Christian duty to honor her husband with her growing certainty that his behavior was an abomination. Is my soul damned if I continue to allow this sin under our roof? Or am I damned if I defy the head of our household? She wrote in one anguished entry. The traveling preacher's failure to help represented a particular betrayal, as he chose to uphold patriarchal authority over the clear moral imperative to protect innocent children. Isabella found similar spiritual conflicts documented in other frontier women's writings, suggesting this was a common struggle for those caught in such impossible situations. Some frontier religious communities developed their own interpretations of Scripture that either condemned or, in rare troubling cases, justified certain forms of incestuous relationships. The most isolated homesteads, like the Thompson place, existed in a kind of legal and social vacuum that created perfect conditions for abuse. With no neighbors close enough to hear cries for help, no regular visitors to notice signs of trouble, and no practical way to summon law enforcement, these households operated under the absolute authority of their male heads. Elizabeth's diary described their homestead as being forgotten by God and man alike, a phrase that captured the profound abandonment felt by abuse victims in such settings. Isabella's research into frontier settlement patterns showed how certain families deliberately chose locations that maximized their isolation, sometimes moving repeatedly when civilization began to encroach. These patterns could indicate a desire for independence and self-sufficiency, but in some cases clearly served to facilitate abuse without interference. The diary mentioned Jeremiah's rage whenever Elizabeth suggested moving closer to the growing settlement 20 miles away, his insistence on remaining isolated becoming more vehement as his behavior toward his daughters worsened. This deliberate isolation as a tactic of abusers remains recognizable in modern domestic violence cases, though the frontier context made it particularly effective and devastating. The journey of healing for survivors of frontier incest was rarely documented, as the silence around such experiences typically extended beyond the abuse itself to its aftermath. Elizabeth's diary offered unusual insight into this process, documenting her daughter's slow recovery after Jeremiah's death. She described Mary's nightmares gradually becoming less frequent, Sarah beginning to speak again after months of silence, and the younger children losing their fearful flinching at sudden movements. It is as if the sun has finally risen after the longest night, Elizabeth wrote 6 months after her husband's death. The diary showed how the family began to rebuild their lives, with Elizabeth teaching her daughters skills that would help them achieve independence. She arranged for Mary to apprentice with a seamstress in the nearest town, ensuring she would have a way to support herself without depending on marriage. Sarah showed an aptitude for nursing and began assisting the local midwife. Isabella was deeply moved by these accounts of resilience and her great-grandmother's determination that her daughters would have better lives than she had known. As Isabella completed her research into her family's disturbing history, she faced difficult questions about how to honor these ancestors' experiences. Should she share Elizabeth's diary with other family members, exposing a past they might prefer remained buried? Should she contribute her findings to historical research on frontier life, helping to correct the sanitized narrative that had erased experiences like her great-grandmother's. The more she learned about the prevalence of incest and abuse on the American frontier, the more convinced she became that these stories needed to be acknowledged as a part of our national history. Elizabeth had risked everything to protect her children from abuse. Perhaps Isabella's role was to ensure that their suffering and survival were not forgotten. She decided to transcribe the diary and donate it to a historical archive, with the names changed to protect her family's privacy while still preserving this important testimony. The frontier experience had been glorified in American culture for generations, but the reality included darkness that deserved honest examination. Elizabeth's story represented countless others who had never been able to document their experiences or find justice in their lifetimes. With her research completed, Isabella returned to her great-grandmother's diary one last time, reading the final entry with new understanding. "I do not regret what I have done. My children will grow strong and free, and the poison that infected our home has been purged forever. Perhaps God will judge me harshly for taking a life, but I believe He knows I had no other choice. If there is punishment to come, I accept it willingly, knowing my daughters now have a chance at lives unmarked by shame and fear. That is worth any price I must pay." Isabella closed the diary gently, feeling a profound connection to this ancestor whose desperate courage had changed the course of their family's history. The true story of the American frontier included not just the mythologized tales of rugged individualism and conquest of the wilderness, but also these hidden histories of vulnerable people fighting their own battles for survival and dignity within the walls of isolated cabins. Elizabeth Thompson had been both victim and ultimately victor in her frontier struggle, finding a terrible strength when it was needed most.